My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because what I am about to reveal may explain why the energy around this connection has felt strangely different. Do not rush away from these words. Do not assume that silence always means distance, because sometimes silence begins when a person hears something they were completely unprepared to hear. In this cinematic message of spiritual reflection, imagine that your soulmate was moving through an ordinary moment when their phone suddenly rang. They were not expecting anything unusual. They answered without knowing that within minutes, their thoughts about you would be shaken. At first, the conversation sounded normal. Their voice was steady. Their attention was divided. But then your name entered the conversation. Something was said about you, something they had never heard before, and suddenly their entire expression changed. They stopped responding the way they had been responding. Their voice became quieter. Their mind began racing. The person on the other end may not even have understood how deeply those words landed, but your soulmate did. My beloved child, what they heard was not simply information. It touched a fear, a feeling, and a truth they had been avoiding for far too long. When the call ended, they remained still, staring at the phone as though the conversation had not truly ended at all. It continued inside their mind. They replayed the exact words. They questioned what they believed. And then they thought of you. Not casually. Not briefly. They thought about you with an intensity they had been trying to suppress. Because what they heard made them wonder whether they had completely misunderstood something about you. My child, there is a reason this affected them so strongly. For a long time, your soulmate has been carrying assumptions about what you feel, what you want, and how much this connection still matters to you. Some of those assumptions were never based on a real conversation. They were built from distance, incomplete information, fear, and the stories people create when they do not have enough courage to ask direct questions. They may have convinced themselves that you had stopped caring. They may have believed you had emotionally closed the door. Perhaps they told themselves you were perfectly fine without them, that you had forgotten certain moments, or that whatever existed between you meant more to them than it ever meant to you. Those thoughts allowed them to remain silent because silence feels easier when you convince yourself there is nothing left to protect. But that phone call challenged the entire story they had been telling themselves. Someone revealed something that suggested your silence may not have meant what they assumed. They heard that you had been carrying your own emotions privately. They heard that you had chosen dignity instead of chasing answers. They heard something that made them realize you may have stepped back not because your heart felt nothing, but because you became tired of standing inside uncertainty. And suddenly your soulmate remembered every moment when you gave them an opportunity to be honest. Every time you waited for clarity. Every moment when your energy said, "Meet me halfway," while fear kept them standing still. That is why they went quiet. They were not only processing what they heard about you. They were processing what it revealed about themselves. And my beloved child, before I take you deeper into what was said during that call, if these messages bring comfort to your heart and you want to continue receiving stories of faith, reflection, love, and divine timing, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and stay connected. Let your subscription be a simple reminder that you are choosing messages that encourage you to protect your peace, honor your worth, and listen carefully when life asks you to see something differently. Now remain with me, because the most surprising part of that phone call was not that your name was mentioned. It was what your soulmate learned about the way you handled something they believed would have broken you. They had imagined you reacting differently. Perhaps they expected anger. Perhaps they thought you would speak badly about them. Perhaps they believed you would expose private details, demand explanations, or attempt to force your way back into their life. But according to what they heard, you did something they were not prepared for. You remained composed. You protected what was private. You did not turn your pain into revenge. You did not make your disappointment everyone else's entertainment. And when your soulmate heard this, something inside them became uncomfortable because they realized that while they had been questioning your intentions, your behavior had quietly been answering those questions all along. You had shown a kind of loyalty they did not fully recognize at the time. You had carried certain truths without using them as weapons. That realization struck them harder than they expected. After the call ended, they tried returning to whatever they had been doing before, but their concentration was gone. The ordinary world around them continued, yet internally everything felt interrupted. They kept hearing one sentence from the conversation. It was the sentence that changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Someone had essentially made them understand, you may not know how deeply this person actually cared. Those words stayed. Your soulmate tried challenging them. They searched through memories, looking for evidence that would allow them to dismiss what they had heard. Instead, they found evidence supporting it. They remembered your patience. They remembered moments when you could have walked away but tried to understand them instead. They remembered how you noticed subtle changes in their mood. They remembered conversations where you listened more carefully than they realized. And then came the memories that were harder to face, the moments when they gave you mixed signals, became distant without explaining why, or expected you to somehow understand feelings they refused to communicate. My beloved child, that is when their silence became regret. They began wondering whether they had mistaken your patience for permanence. They had unconsciously believed there would always be another opportunity to explain themselves. Another day. Another conversation. Another chance to tell you what they truly felt. But the phone call carried an unexpected warning: you had changed. Not changed in the way fear first told them. Not colder. Not crueler. Not bitter. You had simply begun learning how to protect your emotional energy. And this frightened them because a person who has learned peace no longer responds to confusion the same way. They realized that the version of you who once waited endlessly for answers might no longer exist. They began imagining what would happen if they contacted you now. Would you answer? Would your voice still carry the same warmth? Would you listen carefully, or would you finally say, "Why did you wait so long?" They did not know. And uncertainty suddenly became their burden instead of yours. For so long, you may have been the one wondering what they felt. Now they were wondering what you would allow. There is a difference. Feelings can remain quietly alive, but access can change. Your soulmate began understanding that loving someone does not mean remaining endlessly available to their indecision. And strangely, instead of making them resent you, this realization increased their respect for you. My child, the person who called them may have had no intention of creating such an emotional shift. Perhaps they simply mentioned something they had noticed. Perhaps they described an interaction involving you. Perhaps they told your soulmate that despite everything, you had never spoken about them with hatred. Whatever the exact detail was within this story, it contradicted something your soulmate had feared. They had worried that they had become a negative chapter in your mind. They had imagined you remembering only disappointment. But hearing that you still carried yourself with maturity made them recognize something painful. You had offered grace even when they had not offered clarity. That does not mean you were supposed to tolerate everything. It means your heart did not need to become cruel simply because it had been hurt. And your soulmate saw that difference. Suddenly, they were remembering you not only through attraction or longing, but through character. That was new. They began seeing qualities they had previously taken for granted. Then another detail surfaced during the call. Someone mentioned that you had recently been focusing more strongly on yourself, your peace, your direction, your future. And my beloved child, this was the moment their stomachs seemed to drop. Because they understood what that could mean. You were not sitting still emotionally. You were becoming stronger. You were creating a life that did not require unanswered questions to be resolved before you could move forward. Your soulmate had once assumed your feelings guaranteed that the connection would remain available. Now they understood that feelings and choices are different things. You can care about someone and still choose peace. You can remember someone and still continue growing. You can forgive someone and still require them to approach you differently. This realization made them look at their own behavior with uncomfortable honesty. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided. Why did I stay silent when I wanted to speak? Why did I act detached when I cared? Why did I expect them to understand feelings I never clearly expressed? Why was I waiting for them to make everything safe for me? The answers were not easy. Fear appeared repeatedly. Pride appeared. Past experiences appeared. There were old wounds that taught them vulnerability could become dangerous. There were memories that taught them to leave first emotionally so they would never experience being abandoned. But then you came into their life, and something about this connection reached beyond those defenses. That should have inspired honesty. Instead, for a time, it inspired retreat. The stronger their feelings became, the more exposed they felt. And because they could not control what you meant to them, they tried controlling how much you could see. But that phone call exposed the weakness of that strategy. Hiding feelings did not remove them. Distance did not erase them. Silence did not protect the connection. It simply created space where assumptions could grow. And now your soulmate was discovering that you had been living through that same silence from an entirely different perspective. They imagined what it must have felt like when their words and behavior did not match. They imagined how many nights you may have questioned whether you had misunderstood everything. And for perhaps the first time, they stopped defending their intentions and considered the impact. That distinction changed something. My beloved child, there was another reason they became quiet after the call. Something about you had been confirmed. A quality they secretly admired but were never certain was real had been demonstrated when they were not watching. This matters because character is easiest to recognize when someone has nothing to gain. Your soulmate heard about something you did when you did not know the information would ever reach them. Maybe you defended their dignity. Maybe you refused to participate in gossip. Maybe you corrected an unfair assumption. Maybe you simply said, "There are things people don't understand," and left it there. Whatever form it took, they realized your kindness toward them was not a performance designed to win their affection. You behaved according to who you were even when they were absent. That realization made their chest heavy because they remembered moments when they questioned whether your feelings were genuine. Now they felt almost embarrassed by those doubts. They had searched for hidden motives because vulnerability made trust difficult for them. Yet the evidence they had wanted had arrived through a conversation you never arranged. You did not call them to prove yourself. You did not send someone to persuade them. The information reached them unexpectedly, and because of that, it carried a different weight. They began wondering what else they had misunderstood about you. That question opened a door they had kept locked. What if your distance was not rejection? What if your silence was not indifference? What if your boundaries were not punishment? What if you simply reached a point where you understood that love should not require you to continuously convince someone to recognize your value? Your soulmate sat with those questions, and suddenly several pieces of the past rearranged themselves. Moments that once seemed confusing began making sense. They remembered when you stopped explaining yourself. They remembered when you became calmer after disagreements. They remembered when your messages became less emotionally urgent. At the time, they may have assumed you cared less. Now they wondered whether you were simply learning not to abandon yourself while caring for them. And my child, that thought frightened them more than anger would have. Anger can sometimes reassure a person that emotional attachment is still demanding attention. Peace is different. Peace says, "I can care and still continue living." Your soulmate sensed that change in you even before the phone call. They simply did not know what it meant. Now they did. So they reached for their phone again. Your name was there. For several seconds they stared at it. Their thumb hovered over the screen. They imagined calling you immediately. They imagined your voice answering. Their heart accelerated because suddenly all the sentences they had postponed came rushing forward at once. They wanted to tell you that they had misunderstood your silence. They wanted to ask whether what they heard was true. They wanted to admit that hearing someone else describe your character had forced them to confront how much they had taken for granted. Most of all, they wanted to know whether there was still enough trust between you for an honest conversation. But they did not press the call button. Not yet. Because another thought stopped them. What if I contact them and they ask me what I actually want? That question exposed everything. Your soulmate could no longer approach you simply because they missed you. Missing someone is an emotion. Building something requires intention. They understood that if they reopened the door, they would need to be clearer than before. They could not return with half answers and expect your heart to accept them. They could not say, "I've been thinking about you," and then disappear when vulnerability became uncomfortable. If they came toward you now, they would have to decide whether they were ready to show through action what they had hidden in words. For the rest of that day, the phone call remained in their mind. They replayed the tone of the person who spoke about you. They replayed the details. They remembered one specific phrase again and again. And the more they thought about it, the more another feeling appeared, fear that someone else might eventually recognize what they had been too afraid to honor. This was not possessiveness. It was consequence becoming visible. They imagined you meeting someone who did not hesitate. Someone who recognized your emotional depth immediately. Someone who communicated clearly instead of forcing you to decode silence. Someone who saw your loyalty and protected it rather than questioning it. And suddenly your soulmate understood that love does not reserve people for us while we decide whether we are brave enough to show up. My beloved child, that realization created urgency. They walked through their memories with you differently. They remembered your laughter. They remembered little details about your expressions. They remembered things you told them that they pretended to forget but never actually did. They remembered the strange comfort of knowing you were somewhere in their world. And then they realized how much of that comfort had been built on an assumption that you would somehow remain emotionally nearby. The phone call shattered that assumption. You were moving, growing, learning. And they could either grow too or remain behind with words they never said. Later, when they were finally alone, they opened your conversation again. This time they did not immediately close it. They scrolled through old messages. Some made them smile. Others created regret. They noticed moments when you were trying to communicate more than they understood at the time. They saw places where their replies were shorter than what they truly felt. They recognized conversations where fear made them pretend to be casual when internally they were anything but casual. Then they began typing. At first, only a few words appeared. They erased them. They tried again. Deleted them again. Because, hey, how have you been, felt dishonest when there was so much beneath it. They considered writing, I heard something about you today. That felt closer. But even that sentence frightened them because they knew your next question would be obvious. What did you hear? And my beloved child, this is where the story becomes deeper, because there was one part of that phone call I have not revealed yet. The caller did not simply tell your soulmate that you had remained respectful or that you were moving forward. Near the end of the conversation, they mentioned something you had apparently said, something about your soulmate specifically. Your soulmate immediately asked them to repeat it. The caller did. And everything became quiet. Because the words were not what your soulmate expected. They had spent months preparing themselves to hear that you were angry. They had prepared themselves to hear that you had forgotten them. They had even prepared themselves to hear that you wanted nothing to do with them anymore. But they were not prepared for what was actually said. It revealed that somewhere beneath your boundaries, beneath your silence, beneath all the growth and emotional distance, you understood something about them that almost nobody else had understood. And when your soulmate heard the exact words you had supposedly spoken, they realized something that made them put the phone down and stare into silence. You had seen through the version of themselves they showed everyone else. You had recognized the fear beneath their distance. You had understood the emotion beneath their silence. And somehow, even after everything, you had not described them as heartless. You had described them as afraid. That one word broke through their defenses. Afraid. Not uncaring. Not cruel. Not incapable of love. Afraid. Your soulmate sat with that word because deep inside, they knew you were right. And now there was no comfortable place left to hide. They opened your message again. This time, they typed an entire sentence. They stared at it for a long moment. Their thumb moved toward send. But just before they touched the screen, another notification appeared. It was from the same person who had made the phone call. There was one more thing they needed to tell your soulmate about you. And when your soulmate opened that message, they discovered the phone call had only revealed half of the truth. My beloved child, the second message appeared on their screen, and for a moment your soulmate simply stared at it. They had already been emotionally shaken by the phone call, already forced to reconsider everything they thought they understood about you, and now the same person was telling them there was more. Their heart began beating differently because something inside them sensed that this next detail would not be easy to dismiss. They opened the message slowly. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them reached somewhere deep. There is something else you should know about what they said. Your soulmate froze. Suddenly the room around them seemed quieter. They read the sentence once, then again, before typing back, "What do you mean?" There was a pause before the response came, and during those few seconds their mind created 100 possibilities. Had you said you were leaving everything behind? Had you admitted you no longer cared? Had someone entered your life? Had you finally decided that whatever existed between you was finished? Every fear they had been avoiding began speaking at once. But when the reply finally appeared, it was not what they expected. The person explained that when your name and this connection had come up, you had not spoken with bitterness. You had not tried to make yourself look innocent while making your soulmate look guilty. Instead, you had said something surprisingly compassionate. You had apparently acknowledged that sometimes people can feel something deeply and still be emotionally unprepared to handle it. You had not excused the confusion. You had not denied the hurt. But you had recognized that fear can make people behave in ways that contradict their own hearts. My child, when your soulmate read this, they lowered the phone. That description felt too accurate. It felt as though you had reached across all the distance and named the exact battle they had never known how to explain. They had spent so much time fearing that you misunderstood them, yet somehow you had understood the part they were most ashamed to reveal. And that understanding created an emotion stronger than relief. It created regret. Your soulmate began asking themselves why someone who had understood them so deeply had ever been forced to wonder whether they cared. Why had they made something so meaningful feel so uncertain? Why had they hidden behind silence when the person on the other side had already sensed what was happening? My beloved child, your soulmate realized that perhaps they had been protecting themselves from a rejection that was never actually happening. They remembered moments when you approached them with softness and they responded cautiously. They remembered questions you asked that were not designed to pressure them but to understand them. They remembered times when you gave them emotional space because you sensed they were overwhelmed. At the time, they interpreted that space as something they could take indefinitely. Now they understood it differently. You were respecting them while hoping they would eventually respect you enough to become clear. That realization hurt. Not because you had done anything wrong, but because they suddenly saw how many opportunities for honesty had quietly passed between you. There had been moments when one truthful sentence could have changed the direction of everything. I care about you, but I am afraid. I need time, but I don't want to lose you. I don't know how to handle what I feel. Any of those sentences would have been more honest than silence. But they had chosen silence because silence required no immediate vulnerability. Now they understood that what protected them temporarily may have wounded the connection permanently. They returned to the unfinished message they had been preparing for you. The words were still there on the screen, waiting. But suddenly what they had written felt insufficient. They deleted the sentence and started again. There is something I need to tell you. They stared at it. Their fingers stopped moving. That sentence felt frighteningly real because once sent, there would be no pretending this was casual. They would be admitting that something remained unfinished. They would be opening a door they had spent months convincing themselves should remain closed. Yet another voice inside them whispered, "If you close it again, you may never know." My child, they were standing between two fears now. The fear of speaking and the fear of never speaking. For the first time, the second fear was becoming stronger. They imagined another year passing. They imagined you moving further into your own life. They imagined hearing someday that someone else had become important to you. And they imagined having to live with the knowledge that when they still had an opportunity to tell the truth, they chose comfort instead. That future frightened them more than your possible rejection. So they continued typing. I heard something today that made me realize I may have misunderstood you. Again they stopped. Their heart raced because the sentence carried accountability. They were not accusing you. They were admitting that their own interpretation might have been wrong. This was unfamiliar territory for someone who had often used certainty as armor. Your soulmate had learned to survive emotionally by convincing themselves they already knew how situations would end. If they expected disappointment first, disappointment could never surprise them. If they assumed you would eventually leave, they could remain partially detached. If they convinced themselves you did not care enough, they never had to risk discovering how deeply they cared. But now the phone call had interrupted those defenses. Someone else had unintentionally handed them evidence that challenged the entire emotional story they had constructed. My beloved child, then something unexpected happened. Instead of sending the message, your soulmate opened an old conversation between you. They began scrolling. Not because they wanted to live in the past, but because they needed to know whether the signs had always been there. They found messages they had once skimmed too quickly. They found moments where your words carried more patience than they recognized. They noticed how often you tried to create clarity without demanding it. They remembered conversations where you gave them an opening to speak honestly and they changed the subject. One particular message stopped them completely. It was not necessarily dramatic. Perhaps it was something simple you had said about wanting honesty, about not expecting perfection, about simply wanting to know where you stood. At the time they had interpreted it as pressure. Reading it now, they saw vulnerability. You had not been demanding certainty about the future. You had been asking for truth in the present. That difference changed everything. They whispered something to themselves they had resisted saying for a long time, I should have told them. Those words carried weight. I should have told them. I should have told them that I cared. I should have told them why I pulled away. I should have told them that their presence affected me more than they knew. I should have told them that sometimes I became quiet because the connection felt too important, not because it meant nothing. My child, regret can either become another prison or it can become a teacher. Your soulmate was beginning to understand this. They could not return to those moments and change their responses. They could not erase your confusion. They could not demand that you become the version of yourself who waited patiently for them. But they could choose whether fear would continue deciding what happened next. And there was another detail from that phone call they could not stop thinking about. The caller had mentioned that you seemed different recently. There was something calmer about you. Something stronger. You were not speaking like someone waiting for another person to determine their worth. You were beginning to speak like someone who had accepted that whatever was meant to remain in your life would need to meet you with honesty. Your soulmate recognized that transformation, and strangely, it made their feelings stronger. They were seeing you not as someone they could lose and reclaim whenever they became ready, but as a complete person moving through your own journey. That humbled them. My beloved child, understand this clearly within this story. Your growth was never supposed to become a strategy for making someone chase you. Real growth does not ask, will this make them come back? Real growth asks, will this help me remain true to myself regardless of what they choose? And that was the energy your soulmate sensed. You were not becoming stronger to punish them. You were becoming stronger because uncertainty had taught you something about your own boundaries. That is precisely why their perspective changed. They realized that if they wanted a place in your future, they could no longer approach you with the habits of their past. They needed courage. They needed consistency. They needed truth. And most importantly, they needed to understand what they actually wanted before placing another emotional question in your hands. So instead of sending the message immediately, your soulmate put the phone aside and asked themselves something they had avoided for months. If they gave me another chance to speak honestly, what would I actually say? The answer came faster than expected. I would tell them I was scared. They swallowed. Then another answer came. I would tell them I thought about them even when I acted like I didn't. Another. I would tell them distance didn't erase anything. Another. I would apologize for making them guess. And finally came the sentence that frightened them most. I would tell them I don't want to lose them. My child, this was the truth hidden beneath everything. Not possession. Not entitlement. Not a belief that you owed them another chance. Simply the recognition that losing access to someone meaningful because of their own fear would become a regret they were not sure they could easily carry. Your soulmate picked up the phone again. This time, they opened a blank note instead of your conversation. They began writing everything without worrying about whether they would send it. Sentence after sentence appeared. They wrote about the first moment they realized you were different. They wrote about the way your presence made them feel understood. They wrote about how frightened they became when their emotions stopped feeling casual. They admitted that they had sometimes created distance because distance gave them the illusion of control. They admitted they had watched for signs that you still cared while pretending not to care whether those signs appeared. And then they wrote something they had never admitted even to themselves. I kept waiting for you to prove that it was safe for me to love you, while giving you almost no proof that it was safe to love me. They stopped. Read it again. That sentence hurt because it was true. My beloved child, this was the turning point. Your soulmate finally recognized the imbalance. They had wanted reassurance without offering enough reassurance. They had wanted patience without clearly explaining what you were being patient for. They had wanted you to trust feelings they were unwilling to name. And when you eventually stepped back, they interpreted your boundary as abandonment instead of asking whether their behavior had helped create the distance. The phone call forced them to see what pride had hidden. But something else was happening too. They began feeling gratitude toward you. Not because you waited. Not because you suffered. But because despite the confusion, you had apparently refused to turn the connection into something ugly. You had protected your own dignity and theirs. You had allowed yourself to grow without rewriting every meaningful moment as a lie simply because the ending remained unclear. That maturity affected them deeply. They began wondering whether they could become equally mature. Could they contact you without demanding a particular response? Could they apologize without expecting forgiveness immediately? Could they tell the truth without using their feelings to pressure you? Could they accept that you had every right to ask questions? Could they demonstrate change instead of simply announcing it? These questions mattered because your soulmate was beginning to understand that confession is only the beginning. Anyone can speak beautifully during an emotional moment. The real test comes afterward. Do their choices remain consistent when fear returns? Do they communicate when things become uncomfortable? Do they respect boundaries? Do they show up? Your soulmate knew that if they contacted you, you might be watching those things more carefully than their words. And perhaps you should. My child, love does not require blindness. Compassion does not require abandoning discernment. You can understand why someone behaved a certain way without pretending their behavior did not affect you. You can forgive someone and still ask whether they have truly changed. You can listen without promising anything. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that your heart was not a prize they could claim through one emotional confession. It was something they would need to approach with respect. Hours had passed since the original phone call, but they were still carrying it. The ordinary conversation that began unexpectedly had become a mirror. They thought they were learning something about you. Instead, they learned something about themselves. Then the caller contacted them once more. This time, it was another call. Your soulmate hesitated before answering. Hello? The person on the other end spoke carefully. There is something I didn't tell you earlier because I wasn't sure whether I should. Your soulmate's entire body became alert. What? There was a pause. It has to do with why they stopped reaching out. My beloved child, those words struck them immediately. Your soulmate had created countless explanations for your distance. They had assumed you became bored. They assumed you met someone else. They assumed you stopped caring. Sometimes they even told themselves you had never felt what they felt. But now someone was about to tell them there was a specific reason. What happened? Your soulmate asked. The answer came slowly. The caller explained that there had been a moment when you realized something important. You had apparently reached a point where continuing to ask for clarity was beginning to cost you your peace. You still cared, but you understood that caring could not be the only thing holding the connection together. You needed reciprocity. You needed to know that you were not carrying the emotional weight alone. Your soulmate closed their eyes. Because they remembered the exact period. They remembered when your energy changed. They remembered the last meaningful conversation before you became quieter. And suddenly they remembered something they had said. Something careless. Something they never realized you had taken seriously. Their face changed. They asked the caller, "Did they mention what I said?" The caller hesitated. Yes. Your soulmate's heart sank. Because now they knew. There had been one sentence they spoke when they were afraid, words designed to make themselves appear less emotionally invested than they truly were. At the time, they thought you would understand that they were confused. You did not hear confusion. You heard a boundary. And because you respected them, you stepped back. My beloved child, imagine the realization moving through them now. They had spent all this time believing you abandoned the connection, when in reality you may simply have believed the words they gave you. They had wanted you to see beneath their words. But they never told you to. They expected your heart to translate fear into love. And now they understood how unfair that expectation had been. After the second call ended, your soulmate did not hesitate the same way. They opened your conversation. The unfinished message appeared. They deleted everything again. Then they wrote something simpler. Something honest. No performance. No mystery. No attempt to make you chase an explanation. Just truth. I've been thinking about something I said to you, and I finally understand how it may have affected you. I should have been honest then. If you're comfortable with it, I would like the chance to explain. Their finger hovered over the send button. This time, they did not immediately pull away. They breathed slowly. They thought about everything the phone call had revealed. They thought about your patience. Your silence. Your growth. Your boundaries. And the possibility that the connection had not been destroyed by lack of feeling but damaged by lack of communication. They were seconds away from sending it. Then something happened that they could never have planned. Before they could press send, their phone vibrated. A notification appeared at the top of the screen. Your name. For a moment, they genuinely thought their mind was playing tricks on them. But it was there. A message connected to you had arrived at the exact moment they were preparing to contact you. Their breathing changed. Their hand froze. They opened it. And what they saw made them sit completely still. Because suddenly your soulmate understood that the unexpected phone call was not the biggest revelation of the day. Something else had just happened. Something involving you. And whatever they were about to read could determine whether the words they had waited so long to say would finally reach you, or remain unsent forever.